Let's hit record. Good morning. Yes, we're deep into our session. It is April 26th, the 25th of Nisan. It is a Tuesday. We're studying the entire Talmud presently, Masechet Shabbos, chapter 15, Kuf Yud Dalid, 114a. We are in the final stretch, or I should say we're in our initial descent. And we're heading towards the end of the 15th chapter, approaching the 16th chapter. We're talking about clothing at this moment, a Mishnah that talks about laundering and folding, which we'll get back to in a moment, and preparing from Shabbos to Yontif, Yom Kippur to Shabbos, etc. But now we've taken a nice detour to talk about Kavod Shabbos and clothing. And now we're going to ask another question, which we touched upon yesterday. Amar Rabbi Acha bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yechon. Rabbi Yechon taught, Minayin l'shinoi begadim minat Torah. How do we know that in Jewish tradition, in biblical tradition, changing of clothing is an act of kavod? Rashi, shu derech kavod lifnei hamakim. In a way to honor Hashem is to change your clothing. Shenemar. So we're going to quote from Vayikra. I believe it's actually, excuse me. Is it Sav or Shmini? No, it's Sav. Parsha Sav, talking about the daily Tamid offering, I think. Ufashates begadav v'lavash begadim acherim. When removing the deshen, the ash from the altar and taking it outside, or after doing that, he would take off his clothing, v'lavash begadim acherim, and put on other clothing. He would put on special clothing for the ash removal. Rashi, v'hoitzi es hadeshen. It says v'lavash begadim acherim v'hoitzi es hadeshen. He would change his clothing and take the ashes out of the temple or out of the tabernacle. His kiku hakosov lilboish begadim pechusim b'shas haisas hadeshen. The Torah mandates that the kohen put on work clothing that are of lesser caliber, to protect his special clothing. And so basically, there was special designated clothing for messier work and other garments for nicer clothing. But the bottom line here is we see that to honor Hashem, you want to be mindful and have a separate set of clothing for honorable moments. The Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, the school of Rabbi Yishmael has a slightly different take. Limda Torah derech eretz. It's not that you have to change clothing, but the Torah is teaching us vitzu zayin hamensh, how to have derech eretz. Begadim shebishal behem kedera l'rabbi al yimzay b'hem kois l'rabbi. The clothing you use to do the dirty work, you shouldn't wear when presenting. And so we're imagining a chef who is working in the kitchen and the stuff splatters and he gets all dirty. He should put on a new garment or protect his clothing to be presentable when serving. And I think today we have a wonderful solution called an apron. And many people that would engage in both the cooking and serving would probably take on or swap an apron to reflect this kavod to the person that one is serving. Rashi, so the dirty work, the cooking, is like the removal of the ashes. So he would wear koyanim. He would wear big day kahuna, garments that the kohen wore, but maybe the what do you call it? The thread count was lower, or I don't know. There were clothing that were meant for the dirty work. And so from here we see that wearing nice clothing and having a clean change of clothing is a way to dignify an honorable moment. Today, probably what I'm wondering is this not so obvious that the Gemara needn't mention it? And I guess we should remind ourselves that at different times in different places, maybe people had less changes of clothing or had a different concept of being presentable. And so the Gemara is reminding us of etiquette when dealing with royals. Etiquette when dealing with Hashem is yet to be mindful of presentation, appearance, and professionalism. So if you're going to write a work on the professional standards in the temple, this would be one of the segments, that this would be one of your sources on that matter.
I think that's when the Kohanim discovered Levi jeans.
Do you think the Kohanim wore Levi's in the temple?
Yeah, well, they needed something else. No, when they wanted to get rid of and use something that was different, they wanted to dress down into.
They put on Levi's.
They put on Levi's. Yeah.
Absolutely. I can't imagine any other option.
Right.
From the talk of etiquette of a Kohen, a Levi in the Beis Hamikdash, we're now going to pivot to talk about clothing etiquette of Talmidei Chachamim, those who choose to represent the Torah or Jewish ideals, to be a person who devotes their life to Torah study and to Torah instruction. It is expected of such a person to represent and bring dignity to the tradition and the God they purport to represent. It would be shameful for a Torah scholar to wear patched shoes to the marketplace. You got to wear no secondhand, no tattered clothing. Gemara says, are you sure about that? Well, I can think of a Talmid Chacham who was a model Talmid Chacham, and he did have patches in his shoes. So Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, Nafik. Rabbi Acha bar Chanina would go out into the marketplace, although he had patched shoes. Rabbi Acha bar Rav Nachman, so Rabbi Acha bar Rav Nachman is compelled to slightly amend this teaching. But Taloi al Gav Taloi, there's a difference between a patch and a totally patched. A patch is, sometimes your patches need patches. When your patches need patches, it's time to swap out your shoes.
Rabbi, we have so many stories of Talmid Chachamim who were poor and
Indeed.
Desperate and no furniture. How do we jive with this?
Well, I think that's interesting. An important point. Maybe the question here is a matter of choice. We're talking about people that were affluent or were able to afford it. They should be mindful of their appearance. Maybe the societal norm or the cultural reality of a Talmid Chacham was different from time and place. In the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Gemara, they may have had more access to resources. And I think we could actually prove that this is likely to be the case, because only people that had an alternate means of source of income were able to send their kids to the yeshivas. And so the odds were that the people that in those days that were the Talmidei Chachamim did have some degree of affluence, or at least family that they would lean upon. And then, of course, we also know that the sages of the Mishnah are strongly encouraged to work, because you need to have an income. And so the expectation, I suppose, is either a person had a source for funding or they were working to be funded, and you're expected to budget part of that income to be presentable in the representation of the Torah and Hashem. I suppose that's what we're saying. You're asking a good question. My answer doesn't really satisfy.
Does that mean Chabad should start wearing ties?
In regions where people wear ties, yes, absolutely. Are
ties still a thing?
Or what?
Are ties still a thing?
What's a tie?
What's a tie?
That's a restaurant.
They tell the story about an immigrant who came from the old country. He was coming from New York, and he was in the harbor, Miami Harbor, and he looked at the port, and he threw all of his ties overboard. But hold on, but you're asking a good question. So give me a second. Let me see if I can give you any additional input on your question. Well, first of all, the primary concern is appearance. So if the patch is on the underside of a garment, not a big deal. Elsewhere, the Gemara says that this is only at a time where you don't need to put on weather related garments. Sometimes it's very rainy, and so people will dafka wear clothing they don't mind to get ruined. A Talmid Chacham who is not in public need not be as concerned about this. Over the Rambam doesn't present these waivers. He just says you got to be presentable. I have a feeling that the shtetl Jews who are impoverished Talmidei Chachamim would have loved to not have to present in an impoverished way. I don't think they had many choices. So if the only choice is to abandon Torah or dress with designer clothing, I think our Ashkenazic shtetl Jews would say, you know what? We won't wear designer clothing, but we're still going to study Torah. I imagine that's how we would have to deal with your question, which is a good one. But also, Rebbe, just to point out, a patch, we're not saying it needs to be designer clothing. It just needs to be menschlich. A patch, no big deal. Patches on your patches. Now it's time to go shopping. An additional teaching about Talmud Chacham etiquette. Kol Talmud Chacham. By the way, Dr. Hammer, I remember last time we had a Gemara about Talmud Chacham etiquette. We brought up some understandable discomfort about all of the claims to authority and prestige and social class associated, and I think that we'll probably bring it up in a moment, but it's worthy to consider and to think about if this was a class dynamic or if this was a expectation, a dress code that's being imposed on Talmidei Chachamim, and I think it's a little bit of everything. So let's read the rest of the Gemara and then we can discuss further. A Talmid Chacham that has drippings, they have a cholent stain on their clothing. Chayiv misa revav shuman v'chalav. We're talking about fat, something really unappetizing. Chayiv misa. The person could be chayiv misa. Here, I don't think it means literally chayiv misa. We mean that it is extremely not good. Rashi, shetzarich liyos chashuv. V'hagon lechvay teirasai. The person has to project an aura of chashivos, not for his own honor, but for the honor of Torah. I'm sorry. Shenemar kol misanai avu maves. Those who hate me, maves, love death. Al tikra misanai ela masni ai. Those who make me hated should be deserving of death. When you claim to represent Torah and then cause people to be repulsed by you or lower the value or the appreciation of Torah, that's not a good thing. Rashi, Shememasin asma ve'eni habriyos, they make themselves repulsive to the folks around them. Oh, it's terrible. Stay away from the Torah scholars. They are repulsive. Nimso zemasni as haTorah, they're causing the Torah to be hated, and that is not a good thing. The Gemara then says, Ravina says, no, not revad, not a mess that's from fat, but other kinds of stains that are itmar, and it all depends on the type of garment and the odds and the representation. So here Rabbi Steinsaltz says, we're talking about a blood stain. A blood stain on a person's garment might create the wrong impression. As we know, Jewish tradition prohibits relations during a person's menstrual cycle, and people will say, oh, the Talmid Chacham has the blood on his clothing. Obviously, he's hanging out where he shouldn't, when he shouldn't. And so, or I think we could, that's at least one shot. I think Rashi says that. Alternatively, we could simply say that blood is not a nice thing to have on the clothing. Get a new set of clothing. And that is the story of a Talmid Chacham needing to be dressed comfortably. Dr. Stamler, we're going to temporarily reactivate our question about Tanakh interpretation and commentary along the lines of a Talmid Chacham needing to be presentable. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. The sages quote Rabbi Yochanan asking about a verse in Isaiah, Ma'idich Kasher Holach Avdi Yeshayahu Arom v'Yochef. It says that the prophet, Hashem's servant, Yeshaya, Isaiah, was walking around naked and barefoot for 3 years. Va'isa yidira Hashem b'yad Yeshayahu ben Amoz limor lech upitachta hasak mi'al masnecha v'nalcha tachlotz mi'al raglecha. Take off your sackcloth, take off your shoes. V'yaskein holach aron v'yachef. He walked around naked and barefoot. And then Hashem said, Kasher holach av Yeshayahu aron v'yachef. As he did so, shaloshanim oisum leifis al Mitzrayim al Kush. This is a sign about the Egyptians, the people of Kush. Because again, I don't know if you remember, yesterday we spoke about that in the time of Hezekiah, in the time of the reign or the term of Isaiah, Yeshayahu. So that is when the king of Assyria was on a rampage and he sent much of the known world into a tizzy. He conquered and shuffled around nations. And this prophecy says that Mitzrayim and Cush will also go into Gullus and they'll be naked and bare like the prophet. And again, the problem was that the Jewish people initially tried to ally themselves with Egypt. And I think this was the prophet and Hashem's way of reminding them that they should not be relying on those other nations. So now the Gemara asks a question. Does it make sense that the famous prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu ben Amoz, would walk around literally naked? How does that make you feel? That doesn't sound right. But maybe there was something very close to naked. Arum, he wasn't wearing clothing. He was wearing begadim beluim. He was wearing worn out, undignified clothing. V'yachef, barefoot. He wasn't wearing proper shoes. Bimin olim hamitulaim. He was wearing worn out, undignified. And here's the Chedush Agadis to talk to Dr. Stammer. For Arum mamish, v'yachef mamish. You think he literally walked around naked and barefoot? He would have been arrested long ago for indecent exposure. So it can't mean that he literally walked around for 3 years naked. Rather, we're talking about that he wore not great, not honorable, not proper clothing. Now you're going to ask a question. Who allows Isaiah to misrepresent the Torah? Can you imagine what people said or thought about Hashem if his prophet walks around naked or even in a very undignified way? That's bad for the stocks. That's bad for the value of the Jewish people. How could Isaiah do it? And of course, the answer is if Hashem tells you to do something, well then, listen to Hashem.
Why do we need this kind of whitewashing? That is, what is wrong with understanding this description literally? After all, Hashem told him to call his children with undignified names, and he followed it. And if he walked naked and barefoot, why should we replace it with patched shoes? I mean, how better does it make? What purpose does this explanation or modification serve?
So I'll tell you what I was thinking. And first of all, I'm sure Dr. Stamler endorses your question, which is a good one.
I'll tell you, in this case, I would call it poetic license.
Oh. Doctor, you're becoming hard to predict.
It does not change the essence of the story. With Ruth and David, it changes the essence.
Right, yeah.
So I have a greater problem over there. Here, I would just call it not necessarily whitewashing, but...
So, Doctor...
this is just a cover-up.
Professor, here's what I would suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll take it or leave it. I believe this is a proof. There was a prevailing known oral tradition about how to read this segment in Isaiah, and then it didn't mean that he walked around naked literally for 3 years or barefoot literally for 3 years. It was known that it was figurative or a poetic license describing an extremely poor degree of clothing and footwear. And this is all being introduced as proof. Basically, they punched into the computer, they searched the term minalim mitulaim. Well, they didn't, it was in their brain, and they pulled this text up as a little bit of a support or a source that about how problematic patched, tattered clothing was. So I don't think the Gemara here is concerned about Isaiah. The Gemara has in their repository this teaching, this commentary about Isaiah, and it's being brought to introduce or to support this notion that it's extremely not ideal to wear such clothing. Now you'll ask, and I'll ask, surely you don't need a biblical source or a Mishnaic Talmud source to tell us that it's not great to have tattered clothing. Obviously, if a person's given a choice to have new clothing or old clothing, they would choose new clothing. But nonetheless, that's how I understand it. But
Rabbi,
yes,
maybe they're just giving us the bare facts.
the bare facts.
Rabbi,
Yes.
this is Dove, the bear, calling in. The issue of what people wear is very important and interesting, particularly in our society. So we know that even over the last 20 years, most of the Jewish day schools, including yeshivas, have imposed a certain dress code, and often it's very much uniformity, wearing the same thing, so as kids not to have to compete, blah, blah, blah. But my question is, and I have my own thoughts, but let's take as an example Chabad. Let's take black and white. Let's take whether children or adults dress that way pretty much most of the week, including Shabbos. Okay, what is the message that gives to the person doing it and also to the outside world? It's supposed to be anivos, whatever. What's going on?
So first of all, two things. First of all, I think it's generally I am in favor of uniforms in schools. I think it is a good equalizer, and it takes away, and again, independence is very important, but it also takes away a certain social pressure that kids don't need to contend with in school.
I will give you a little bit different way of thinking at it. And I'm not just talking about kids in schools. That's one issue. But in general, in the Haredi community and the Hasidic community,
That's point number two, but go ahead.
That's really what I was more
if you look at
interested
the
in.
military, if it's a point of control. If you look at the military wears uniforms. Everybody has the same uniform. You have to listen to what your commanders tell you to do and what to wear. Each sect, the Garrett wears something else. Then this one wears white socks. These wear striped. The other side wears striped bekishes. Everyone has something to differentiate between him and the other, because it's a question of control. I belong to this unit, and this is my commanding officer, and I have to listen to what he tells me to do. That's the way I look at it.
So I think using the word control makes me uncomfortable, although it certainly is appropriate under certain circumstances.
I use this specifically.
I'm sorry?
I specifically use control because I feel certain.
No, I think in certain Haredi,
and they are skanim and
in certain Zramim, it's true that control is the issue. First of all, sociologists, I would say, would have a field day, but they do have a field day with this. Why do different societies choose to have a uniform? Is it about self-identifying? Is it about creating a certain common expectation? Is it about what they project externally? And I would propose that there isn't really one single motivator about the relative uniformity of clothing in the quote-unquote Haredi population. I think different Zramim have different motivations, or at least nuanced motivations. So, for example, if you'll go back 50 years ago, I don't think in Israel or in America there was the same emphasis on uniform. But even then, there was a certain general more formal presentation. It just was extremely not regulated. People kind of chose their own. In Chabad, for example, and I think Chabad was until recent times the least uniform. Today, not so much, but until 25 years ago, Chabadnik, they might wear a jacket and hat for prayers you would see. But as far as like what kind of shirts or clothing, there was very free reign. I think Chabad borrowed a lot of some of its more recent from the general Haredi or Litvak community, because how you dress affects how you see yourself. And if you're strongly associated with a certain group, your behavior it'll be easier for you to reflect behavior. What kind of behavior? Well, Torah and mitzvot, Kiddush Hashem, and other type things. So, Doctor, maybe that is control. Maybe it isn't. There's a lot more on the subject. But I think a lot of it is to help a person have a self-respect. Now, sometimes there is an original motivator, and that's lost when it becomes expected. Because once you do something out of expectation, that's really the predominant prevailing theme, as opposed to the specific message that is sought to be conveyed. In other communities, it's explicitly about distinguishing and differentiating and setting that group apart from others. So I think in the Hasidic world, sometimes the specific garment is not so much about a cohesion between the members of the community, but more to set them apart from other communities for whatever given reason, and to help create a stronger sense of identity.
If you look at soccer teams, you have the same issue. Soccer teams, they have their own colors, they have their own.
But is that an issue, or is it a dynamic?
No, it's not an issue, but it's a question of differentiating itself from the cloud, from the others. I am better than you are. Those are my colors.
Rabbi,
especially in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism, we have enough things bothering us from the outside that we shouldn't have things differentiating us from the inside.
Rabbi.
Yes.
In Israel, it comes down to the kippah. It depends what kippah you wear.
Here too.
Or whether you wear a kippah.
Yeah.
So, Bernie, I thought you were a kippah Skruga type, but I guess you changed. I'm looking at what you're wearing.
It depends which bar mitzvah one I pull out of the drawer.
Right. And you became a baseball hat type. I know what that is. That's
I'll tell you a story. Maybe my son would be upset that I'm telling the story. But when my son went to Yeshiva University, he on Purim, he put on black and white, and he put on a velvet yarmulke. And all of a sudden, he said, going down the elevator and walking around, people said hello to him. They never said hello to him before. And it bothered him that when he puts on a velvet yarmulke and wears black and white, certain people said hello to him where otherwise didn't. It really bothered him. He's probably, if he hears that I told the story, probably be upset with me.
But there are stories of individuals who at a certain point in their Jewish journey decided to put on a kippah. And when they started putting on the kippah, all of a sudden they found that it was harder for them to not eat unkosher food. And so a lot of times these garments are really less about it, a lot of it's about how it affects one's own psyche. Anyways, I think we need to give this a lot more thought. We could probably bring on a panel of sociologists that can talk about the different reasons in Haredi and general garments. I noticed the same thing, by the way, in a lot of Christian and African-American schools in New York that try to take on a little bit of a military format, and they do it. And I wonder if maybe that's the same idea Dr. said before. Is it about behavior? Is it about control? Is it about uniformity? I think it's all of the above, with a variety of different motivators. And there's another question, which is it good or is it bad? And what I'll tell you for sure, this comes down to Dr. Hammer's common discussion. If it helps, maybe it's good. But it's always important not to let superficial appearance become the central focus of religion, because faith religion, spirituality is meant to be an inner or primarily an inner and not an external process. So you never want to swap the inner journey for the external journey. But if they're complementary, let's say it works for those that it works for. Anyways,
Catholic schools have been doing it for generations.
right.
Uniforms. I mean, I remember, I don't remember when in my lifetime when Catholic schools and Catholic kids who went to didn't have uniforms, usually plaid. I mean,
Well, I think Dr. Stamler, I think we have to differentiate between school uniforms and zerem and uniforms of an entire zerem, but then again, doctors have a certain, professionals wear certain clothing, and that's
only
about
when they're working.
I'm sorry?
Or when they're working.
At work.
Okay.
Only when they're on duty.
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So now Bernie mentioned something, but if you think of it, the Catholics have gone the other way. The nuns and all those are now wearing regular clothes rather than their habits.
Why are they doing that?
I don't know. I'm just saying it. There's forces going both ways.
Of course, there's always going to be forces going all different ways. Anyways, all right, let's do a little more Gemara. The doctor, this is interesting. This is probably, unfortunately, yet the tip of the iceberg and somewhat superficial, but it's interesting nonetheless to ponder. And I think ultimately there has to be a certain respect, or at least allowing different folks to do what works for them. And so, every zerem has their own way of dealing with the question. And I think if it works for them, la briut. And that's how I see it. But I may be biased. No, that's what we just did. Tanan Hassam, on the subject of stains. Rivav al hamardas choitzeitz. If there's a fat stain on a saddle, it is a chatzitza. It interferes with mikveh, purification, because people generally don't want to have a stain on their stuff. They want to clean it off first. So if you keep it on, it's a chatzitza, it's an interference. It's a stain when it's the size of a Italian isar, not smaller. It's a garment that just has a stain on one side. That's not considered a chatzitza. But if it bleeds through, it is a chatzitza. So we have three opinions. Two opinions. There's an opinion that says that a garment that has a stain, if it doesn't bleed all the way through, it's not considered a chatzitza, an interference. If it's on both sides, it interferes. And Rabbi Yehuda says no, even one side is a problem. What's the crux of their machlekes? Like Rashi called davar chaytzis lingin tefillah, the kapid allow. When you would want something removed, it's considered interference for the purposes of dunking in the mikveh. And a stain that's on both sides, that's a super extensive, exhaustive stain. Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Rabbi Chanina, a question that Rish Lakish asked Rabbi Chanina. Mardas, a saddle. We set up here that it's stained. It's a chatzitza, and you need to remove it before dunking in the mikvah. Are we talking about it goes through and through, or just on one side? He said, I don't have any clear tradition about a saddle stain, but I do have a similar tradition that may inform our question about a saddle. The Tanan Rabbi Yossi, our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi taught kol banoim. What is a banoim? Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz first. Okay. Shel ban, I say misread it. Shel banoim, builders, clothing. Dr. Hammer, Levi's. Mitzad echad, a stain on one side is a problem. Vishel bar, but folks that are involved in pit, no, Vishel bur. My mistaken translation is an act of burut, of ignorance, an ignoramus, an unsophisticated person. Mishnei tzedadim, a simple person I want to be careful of the right word. Maybe in American society, they would use they would describe it as a person. Can we use the R word? Or can you say redneck anymore? Is that an offensive?
Sure is.
It is offensive, right? I don't think it's a nice thing to say. Anyways, but a person that's less sophisticated, or we should say it nicely, living a more simple life. So Mishnei Tzedadim. So they're not concerned about a small stain, but they're concerned about a greater stain. And we shouldn't treat the clothing of the status of a saddle more strictly than the garments of an Am Haaretz. So basically, a one-sided stain is not a problem. A two-sided stain is a problem. What is a banoi? So we translated it to mean a worker, a builder. But you may recall that the Talmud uses the term builder, or the Mishnah uses the term builder as a code for someone else. Who is a builder? My banoim. A banoi, a builder, is a person that studies Torah all their life. And so they're engaged in life creating, world supporting work of Torah study. And so what we now reading this again, a Torah scholar who is mandated, has a mandated uniform, they have to represent the Torah and they can't have any stains. Well, then even a one-sided stain bothers them or should bother them. Therefore, that stain is a chatzitza, interferes with the mikvah. But a person who's less concerned about that, well, then we're only worried about what concerns them. And because you can manage with the garment even with little stains, so the stain is only a problem if it's really, really deep and deeply absorbed. If you aren't disturbed enough yet, hold on. Rabbi Yosef Amar Shalbanaim, Poligad Rabbi Yehuda Amar Bishmal, Beged Shalbanaim Tatacham Makmin Al Vashem Mitzad Echad Shalbor. So this Gemara understands that there was a certain societal standard. A person that was considered a Talmid Chacham had one self-imposed expectation or Torah-imposed expectation, but the Hamon Am. But here it's a more of a pejorative than just that. The people that were quite simple and unsophisticated, well, they were less concerned about a stain, and that was the halacha. Take it or leave it. But now is where we get interested.
I think in general, clothing, especially in those days, they weren't as prevalent. They were expensive. People didn't have, like today, multiple clothing.
Right.
I mean, we see even when someone is has a loss and he does kriya, whether there's questions whether you can restitch it. So, for instance, on your father and your mother, you can't. But I think on other relatives, you can't stitch it up back so you can wear it again. So
right.
This issue with clothing was an important issue to them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're right. People only had 1, 2, 3 sets of clothing, and so the tear clothing was a massive deal. It truly was. All right, so now the Gemara is going to ask another question. The Talmid Chacham, who was worthy of the title, had other perks. One of the perks was a certain degree of credibility. Usually, if you lose something, Hashavas Aveda, the finder only returns it with a very solid siman. Anyone that studied Eilu Metzias knows there's a lot of discussion about the precise parameters of what's considered a sign that a person can use to prove that it was their item. But a Talmid Chacham, you could show it to them and they'll say, yeah, I recognize it, it's mine, or I don't recognize it, and he gets the item. Rashi. Kivan Sha'amar Makir Ani, or Ani Makir. Makira, a person says, I recognize it. Afal Pisha ain't a nice of a siman. Even if he doesn't give a specific sign, he could receive it. Who is the Talmid Chacham that has this degree of credibility? This is the person who lives fully in the lifestyle and the presentation of a Talmid Chacham to the point where he's careful about his clothing. And if there's a stain, he turns it over, which means he fully embraces his role as a representative of the Torah. That Rashi, I'm sorry, person whose clothing gets turned around will make sure to straighten it so that he's constantly presenting the Torah in a proper way. What kind of Talmud Chacham has such credibility and is worthy of respect to the point where they might be pointed as a communal leader? This is a high standard. This is a person who you could ask any halachic matter on any topic and he'll have the answer at his fingertips. Even in Meseches Kala, which is an obscure Mesechta, Rashi, B'chol Shas, Afilu Meseches Kala, B'lei Rigla Beinshi, V'nez Zen Oisan Libay, V'garsa, Meseches Kala Braisahi, Kala B'lei Bracha Asur L'Balagim. Anyways, long story short, a Talmud Chacham or Talmidei Chachamim were in those days a separate, and maybe like today, or maybe there are those that like to reflect or mimic that society, and that's a whole another discussion that is worthy of having at another time. And the bottom line is, really the expectation, you want to be called a Talmud Chacham? Well, at this point, you got to know the whole Talmud and all the subjects of Jewish law. Tomorrow we'll add some qualifiers. Not everybody had that degree of knowledge and they could yet be a Talmud Chacham. But anyways, the bottom line is our Gemara today was mostly talking about clothing etiquette, the honor that clothing can convey, the status that clothing can convey, and the expectation of a Talmud Chacham to responsibly represent the Torah that he purports to represent. My dear friends, have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we'll be able to resume tomorrow in good health and good circumstances. And again, a big Yashir Kayach.